So today we're going to have a look at non-vascular and seedless vascular plants as well as seed plants. So the first part of this lecture will look at the evolution of green algae into land plants. Then we'll look at the life cycle of lichens and many non-vascular plants and how they are dominated by the gametophytes. And finally we'll look at ferns and several non-seed vascular plants. So what are the characteristics of fungi and plants? Well, plants, such as trees, flowers and ferns, are eukaryotic, non-motile organisms that use photosynthesis to generate energy. Fungus such as mushrooms, yeast and mold are eukaryotic, non-motile organisms that are heterotrophic, which means that they must take in nutrients for energy. Characteristics and evolutionary history. Plants are photosynthetic, and these are autotrophs. What is an autotroph? An autotroph is an organism that can produce its own food using light, water, carbon dioxide or other chemicals. Because autotrophs produce their own food, they are sometimes called producers. Now, fungi are eukaryotic. Both of them are eukaryotic and both do not move. They are considered non-motile. So let's have a further look at the evolution of plants. So ancestors of plants were plant-like protists. Now, protists are typically divided into three categories, including animal-like protists, plant-like protists, and fungus-like protists. Now, the characteristics of protists: they are eukaryote, which means they have a nucleus. Most of them have a mitochondria, and they all prefer aquatic or moist environments. So let's have a quick look at the evolution of fungus. They are genetically more similar to animals than plants. Fungi evolved from fungus-like protists. What are fungus-like protists? Well, a good example is the mold on your bread. There's actually two groups, slime molds and water molds. Now, most fungus-like protists use pseudopods, false feet, to move around. Another type of fungus-like protists is water mold. Now, most of them are small, single-celled organisms. Now, the oldest forms of fungi, evolutionarily speaking, are small, simple, and they live in lakes and soils. The mold that grows on your bread from Paris baguette or fruit left out, these have root-like structures called hyphae. The next group is the sac fungi, such as truffles and morchella. The last group contains organisms such as mushrooms and shelf fungi. So let's have a look at the evolution of green algae into land plants. Now, roughly 410 million years ago, the transition from water to land began. Now, at that time, many species of charophyte algae were inhabiting shallow waters around the edges of ponds and lakes where they were subject to occasional drying. In such environments, natural selection would have favored individual algae that could survive periods when they were not submerged. In charophytes, a layer of durable polymer called sporopollenin prevents exposed zygotes from drying out. A similar chemical adaptation is found in the tough sporopollenin walls that encase plant spores. The accumulation of such traits by at least one population of charophyte algae, now extinct, enabled their descendants, the first plants, to live permanently above the waterline. This ability opened a new frontier, a terrestrial habitat that offered enormous benefits. So let's have a look at the evolution of green algae and the formation of land plants. Now, green algae is one of the four kinds of algae. All land plants evolved from green algae. Green algae is the most diverse group of algae, with more than 7,000 species growing in a variety of habitats. The green algae is a paraphyletic group. Like the plants, the green algae contains two forms of chlorophyll, A and B, which they use to capture light energy to fuel the manufacture of sugars. But unlike plants, they are primarily aquatic. Because they are aquatic and manufacture their own food, these organisms are called algae. So let's have a look at the evolution of green algae into land plants. The grass-green chloroplasts of green algae have a structure and pigment composition much like the chloroplasts of plants. Green algae can be divided into two main groups: charophytes and the chlorophytes. The charophytes include the algae most closely related to plants. The second group, the chlorophytes, include more than 7,000 species. Now, most of them live in fresh water, but there are also many marine and some terrestrial species. Various species of unicellular chlorophytes live independently in aquatic habitats such as phytoplankton or inhabit damp soil. Some live symbiotically with other eukaryotes, contributing part of their photosynthetic output to the food supply of their host. Still other chlorophytes live in environments exposed to intense visible and ultraviolet radiation. These species are protected by radiation blocking compounds in their cytoplasm, cell wall or zygote coat. Larger size and greater complexity evolved in green algae by 3 different mechanisms. Mechanism number 1. This involved the formation of colonies of individual cells and other species whose filamentous forms contributed to the stringy masses known as pond scum. Number 2. The formation of true multicellular bodies by cell division and differentiation. And number 3. The final mechanism. The repeated division of nuclei with no cytoplasmic division. The first land plants were the bryophytes. Now the bryophytes are represented today by 3 phyla: herbaceous plants, liverworts and hornworts. Liverworts and hornworts are named for their shapes, plus the suffix wort from the Anglo-Saxon for herb. Mosses are familiar to many people, although some plants commonly called mosses are not really mosses at all. These include Irish moss, a red seaweed, reindeer moss, a lichen, club mosses, seedless vascular plants, and Spanish mosses, lichens in some regions and flowering plants in others. Phylogenetic analysis indicate that liverworts, mosses and hornworts diverged from other plant lineages early in the history of plant evolution. Fossil evidence provides some support for this idea. The earliest spores of plants, dating from 450 to 470 million years ago, have structural features found only in the spores of liverworts, and by 430 million years ago, spores similar to those of mosses and liverworts also occur in the fossil record. The earliest fossils of vascular plants date to about 425 million years ago. So what are plants? Plants are organisms that are photosynthetic, are eukaryotic, and have cell walls. Photosynthesis is the process by which autotrophs convert light energy into chemical energy. Eukaryotic means a cell with a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. One key difference between the cells in your body and plant cells is the cell wall. A cell wall is a rigid layer around a cell made up of a sugar called cellulose. The first division of plants is seen in vascular tissue used to transport water and nutrients. There are 2 types of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. Common examples are trees, shrubs and grasses. Now, one way to distinguish groups of plants is whether or not they have an extensive system of vascular tissue, cells joined into tubes that transport water and nutrients through the plant body. Most present-day plants have a complex vascular tissue system and are therefore called vascular plants. Plants that do not have an extensive transport system, such as liverworts or hornworts, are described as non-vascular. Non-vascular plants are often informally called bryophytes, although the term bryophyte is commonly used to refer to all non-vascular plants. Molecular studies and morphological analysis of sperm structure have concluded that bryophytes do not form a monophyletic group, whilst non-vascular plants do not have roots but instead have rhizoids, little hairs that help anchor the plant. Now, non-vascular plants have rhizoids, not roots. Non-vascular plants have different reproductive strategies. Non-vascular plants reproduce sexually by creating single-celled spores or asexually by vegetative propagation. Vegetative propagation is when part of the plant breaks off and develops into a new plant with the exact same genetic information as the original plant. So let's have a look at the alternation of generations. The life cycle of all plants alternate between 2 generations of distinct multicellular organisms, gametophytes and sporophytes. Each generation gives rise to the other, a process that is called alternation of generations. This type of reproductive cycle evolved in various groups of algae, but does not occur in the charophytes, the algae most closely related to plants. Take care not to confuse the alternation of generation in plants with the haploid and diploid stages in the life cycles of other sexually reproducing organisms. Alternation of generations is distinguished by the fact that the life cycle includes both multicellular haploid organisms and multicellular diploid organisms. The multicellular haploid gametophyte is named for its production by mitosis of haploid gametes. eggs and sperm that fuse during fertilization, forming diploid zygotes. Mitotic division of the zygote produces a multicellular diploid sporophyte. Meiosis in a mature sporophyte produces haploid spores, reproductive cells that can develop into a new haploid organism without fusing with another cell. Mitotic division of the spore cell produces a new multicellular gametophyte, and the cycle begins again. Now, if you can't remember all that, remember this. Alternation of generations is a life cycle that includes both diploid and haploid multicellular stages. Diploid means 2 sets of chromosomes and is commonly abbreviated as 2N, where the N stands for 1 set of chromosomes.